Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Laura Benjamins, and I'm a PhD candidate in music education at Western University in London, Canada. My presentation is entitled An Analysis of Researcher Positionality in Religious Worship Contexts. Positionality locates people and their practices in relation to others, framing one's understanding and outlook on the world. Rather than defining individuals in terms of fixed identities, positionality considers one's location within shifting, changing networks of relationships. Reflexivity, meaning one's awareness of their position as a researcher, has little purpose unless it is connected to a greater understanding of what they are doing, the power they are holding, and the multiple identities they possess in relation to the wider world. This presentation considers the concept of positionality and my experiences and challenges as a researcher within musical worship contexts. I critically evaluate my own positionality, acknowledging how my biography, previous experience, and my following of models of reflexive religious subjectivity have influenced my dissertation research process. I consider how my study has been constructed, how interview questions were formulated, and how data are presented in response to such aims. I acknowledge helpful aspects of my insider knowledge, such as my understanding of evangelical categories and my ability to speak the language. However, I also interrogate ethical tensions and difficulties in maintaining trust throughout the research process. I explain how such practices are imperative as well for other community music settings. The purpose of my doctoral research study is to investigate two churches' contemporary worship music-making practices and their reflection of and response to musical and theological fields in which they are located. Using Bourdieu's concepts of capital, habitus, and field, I consider how worship leaders and musicians might strategize their musical behaviors and disrupt or possibly affirm traditional norms of music making in each contemporary worship music setting, or CWM. Further, I explore how such musical behaviors may reflect and shape habitus both individually and institutionally. My doctoral research unites community music and church music fields, and my subject position as a white, heterosexual, able-bodied woman with a Canadian middle-class, classically trained evangelical Christian background influences my relationship to North American evangelicalism and its music. In acknowledging my experience in leading worship music in several church settings, I consider how my own religious affiliation positions me relative to participants' subject positions from the perspectives of race, social class, gender, sexual orientation, and ability. As an observant participant, I find myself resonating with particular church cases over others in terms of their approach to worship. While I have found aspects of musical worship in some settings to be ideologically, theologically, or ethically problematic, I have had to actively work against my perceptions and understandings of data sites as worship experiences for myself. The existing of contrasting theological approaches to church music is particularly relevant for this research, as a church's conceptualization of worship directly flows to their music-making practices. Church music is often directed by understandings of worship as being organized vertically or horizontally. These philosophies of worship, as well as the church's overall position in the social field, impacts approaches to musical worship, such as perhaps the pursuit of excellence for God musically in terms of inclusion of musicians at all skill levels. With the rise of evangelicalism in North America, such contrasting approaches to church music have been seen to reflect denominations' stance on cultural adaptation and engagement, divisions that have really been integral to the fundamentalist modernist split as two general branches of Protestantism. My dissertation specifically addresses Protestant Christian worship as a major branch of evangelical Christianity. CWM in particular has risen in popularity in evangelical churches to advance and expand communities. CWM can be seen by some to have more of a participatory focus with its link to popular musical instruments informal or non-formal learning, and accessibility. The role of CWM in worship, however, varies much according to approaches and understandings of worship mentioned previously, and this end goal of music in the church. Therefore, as I collected data from two churches with varying philosophies and approaches to worship, it was necessary for me to acknowledge how my own theology and background influenced my interpretation and approaches to the churches. When conducting research in a cultural context that is seen as familiar, I sought to follow Ingalls' ethnographic methodological considerations in negotiating her shifting relationship with evangelical Christianity. She similarly conducted research focused on evangelical Christianity, both as a Christian worshiper and musician, yet from an ethnographic perspective, which I applied to a case study context. The standard ethnographic field research narrative often centers on the researcher's journey from distance to proximity, as he or she becomes more deeply integrated within the community and as knowledge about a group of people and their practices deepen. For ethnographers who are also culture bearers, however, conducting fieldwork at home, the process tends to be inverted. The process involves a formation of a space of critical distance, especially by those whose research endeavors closely intersect with their daily lives. A researcher may then understand the process as one of defamiliarization, where familiar and thus often overlooked cultural practices are rendered as visible sources of scrutiny. The research field must be carefully and actively constructed when conducting research, possibly resulting in shifts of what constitutes home. Ingalls refers to the presence of intersectionality in research, which emphasizes the multiple mutually influencing aspects of identity that any individual must negotiate. This reminds the researcher that there is often no straightforward classification as of an insider or outsider in particular research cases where the researcher is commonly integrated in the field. I found that my subject position as a white woman with a Canadian evangelical Protestant Reformed background helped me gain access and trust quite easily in Christian worship communities. Similar to Ingalls, my background and lifelong experience with North American churches provided me with a thorough understanding of evangelical terms and categories for describing worship and religious experiences. My ability to speak the language fluently appeared to lead to a sense of trust among study participants. In my interview questions and non-participant observation, however, I strive to keep a distance from participants in order to properly represent my position as a researcher and to maintain my ability in carefully and critically analyzing music making processes. In this way, when engaging in conversations with participants, I attempted to position myself as a Christian worshiper, yet without giving too many specifics about my theological beliefs or background in a Christian Reformed church, as this could have stifled conversations or participants' expressions of individual theological beliefs. Butler and Summit provide two helpful ethnomusicological models of reflexive religious subjectivity that were beneficial in framing my research methodology and negotiating my complex subject position. Butler begins his research on Pentecostal music making in an Afro-Caribbean context by stating his position as an African-American Pentecostal Christian church musician, emphasizing that his experiences in the field may help paint a multi-sided canvas of research that contributes to a particular distinctiveness of research. Butler also refers to the rhetorical acrobats that are involved when negotiating between the dialogues of faith and scholarship as a researcher who is both an ethnographic and religious observer. In acknowledging the difficulties of this negotiation, Butler takes an anthropological approach that moves away from participant observation towards the observation of participation. This shift moves away from dispassionate observation towards the participatory aspects of the field experience. Drawing from Butler's work, I have focused on the participatory aspects of field experiences, observing my experience singing along in my head, perhaps, to songs and worship rehearsals that I've observed, and acknowledging that I perceive through observation the religion that I'm studying in multiple diverse ways. Summit similarly can maintain a complex subject position throughout his research as he continued his role as a rabbi studying Jewish congregational music making. He explains that as a committed Jew, he approached his research well equipped by his religious and cultural background and felt like both a guest observer and a participant. As an insider, Summit reflects that he had to pay careful attention to how he approached informants, taking care not to talk with informants too much in the shorthand, trying not to be too quick in understanding participants' responses in order to avoid cutting short valuable observations and explanations. He also tried not to show off his language of knowledge of the liturgy and music in terms of his language, which might possibly intimidate informants and keep them from sharing information. I attempted to follow similar advice in my process of data collection, approaching participants carefully with eagerness to listen and engage rather than provide quick responses. Based on Butler and Summit's two models of reflexive religious subjectivity and difficulties that were addressed, I found it necessary to establish honest, trustworthy relationships with participants while clearly acknowledging and reflecting upon my own subjectivities, positionalities, agenda, and thinking throughout the research process. While I was able to move in and out of various roles and vantage points as a researcher, I found that my own religious affiliation positions me in relation to participants and their racial, social class, and gendered subject positions. My study was constructed for the purpose of examining music making experiences in churches, a phenomenon that is of interest to me because of my lifelong engagement in the church through leading and accompanying worship services. I chose two contrasting church cases, knowing that their approaches to worship would be quite different. I purposefully designed my semi-structured interview questions to be open-ended, inviting participants to explain what worship means to them and why they lead music in church, without too many boundaries in terms of how the questions were framed. I invited interviewees to respond in as much or as little detail as they were comfortable, and I kept an ongoing journal to write down my initial thoughts about participants' responses. I found that an ongoing self-reflective process was integral in appropriately maintaining my complex subject position. I was also careful to include a reference group of other individuals, such as my research supervisors and some trustworthy colleagues, to check my interpretation of data findings and suggest alternative readings or interpretations. Researchers in other community music settings may face similar ethical tensions and difficulty in maintaining trust when they resonate specifically with the community in which they are studying. When reflecting upon my experiences and challenges, I believe it is imperative for researchers to locate themselves, their biography, and experiences when entering a site of data collection. Within all aspects of the research process, including data collection, interactions with participants, analysis, and dissemination, it is necessary for researchers to critically reflect upon their own assumptions, experiences, and positionality. Finding other models of reflexivity to implement within the particular context, such as models of reflexive religious subjectivity that I aim to follow, may be a helpful guide in negotiating tensions that the researcher may face. Finally, drawing upon a fellow community of researchers for feedback and dialogue throughout the research process is one of the key strategies that I found helpful to keep my work honest and trustworthy. The positionality that we hold is an integral element of our research that can influence the research process in its entirety. Interrogating our experiences, potential beliefs, and biases is a difficult but necessary process to maintain reliability, validity, and rigor within our research process. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to comments and questions in future dialogue surrounding these topics. Thank you.